Welcome to tonight's webinar on backyard composting. My name is Lara Schomer, and I'm the Community Outreach Coordinator here at the Hort Society. I'm so happy to see so many people taking advantage of our free member webinar series. We are pleased to be able to offer educational programs to our members both near and far. You are attending the webinar tonight in listen-only mode. So you will be able to hear our presenter, but we can't hear you. That way there won't be any background noise. If you have questions for Ginny or me, you can type those questions in on the panel on the right side of your screen. We will cover the questions at the end of the presentation. If you don't see the panel, look for an orange arrow in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Click on the arrow and it will pop out the panel. And now, please welcome Ginny Black. Ginny is the current chair of the Minnesota Composting Council and past compost expert for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. She will be talking tonight about the do's and don'ts of backyard composting. Thank you, Ginny.
Well, thank you, Laura, and good evening, everyone. This is one of my favorite things to do is talk about backyard composting. So I appreciate all of you folks coming to listen. If you have questions during, as Laura said, during the presentation, just write them down. And if I can answer them during the presentation, I will. Otherwise, we'll do it after I'm through. As Laura said, I am Ginny Black, and I am the current chair of the Minnesota Compost Council. I am also the current chair of the Compost Council's Research and Education Foundation, which is a national foundation that's dedicated to research and education in the composting field. So I've been doing this a long, long time, and I'm going to skip right now to the next slide, I think. Okay, so I always like to start out this presentation with what is soil, because we use soil and dirt rather interchangeably in our society. And soil and dirt are really, if you look them up in Webster's, is two different things. Dirt is something we sweep off our floor and is a nuisance. We dust it off of our furniture, but soil is actually what grows our food and cleans our water. And the components of soil are ground up rock, which could be clay, or silica, which is sand, or a number of other substances, and organic matter, which is what we are making when we're composting yard waste and food waste, basically at our homes, are the materials we usually will compost. And that organic matter allows the presence of microorganisms in the soil that actually they are critical actually to making it a healthy soil, in that they break down the nutrients in the soils. And I'll talk about that a little more too. They also create pore space so that there is air and water. Both plants and the microorganisms need air and water, and if that is not present, you don't have a living soil. You have dirt, and it is an inert and basically a dead material. So a little bit about the benefits. I think many of you probably know these because you're probably composters, or generally, the audiences I speak to, about half or more are composters right now. Water holding capacity. This is what I think is probably the greatest benefit of having organic material in the soils. I have talked with all kinds of people over the years about water holding capacity, trying to get some kind of a gauge on just how much water does compost hold. And I've gotten a variety of answers, anywhere from 4 or 5 times its weight in water it will hold. So I generally, though, have found that it's more reasonable to think of 10 pounds of compost will hold 8 to 12 pounds of water, which is a gallon or a gallon and a half of water, basically. That's a lot of moisture. And without that organic matter in the soil, it's like if you have a sugar sand, it just drains right through. Or if it's a clay, it won't soak in very far at all, or it'll take a really, really long time. So compost breaks up those clay soils, and it helps the sandy soils hold water. So that is one of its greatest capacities. Also, by holding that water and filtering that water through the organic matter in the soils, you can remove surface pollutants like salts, like the salt we put on our streets in the wintertime, some of the fertilizers, if it happens to run off into the street, if it goes into an area that has a high organic content, which wetlands do, and they actually do bind nutrients into those high organic soils. It will actually clean the water for us. It will filter out dirt particles. It does just adds a lot of wonderful characteristics to the soils that help keep our environment clean. The critters, the microorganisms that the organic material allows to live within a healthy soil, break down the nutrients. Some of the nutrients in compost is readily dissolvable like a commercial fertilizer, but at least half of the nutrients in the compost is not water soluble immediately and has to be broken down by the microorganisms in the soil that you have. So that's why we say a slow release. Those nutrients are released over time. And that is one of the benefits of the organic material. Also, the organic material will hold nutrients a little bit longer. But the truth of the matter is the nutrient content of compost varies a lot. If you have just a yard waste compost, if we're looking at that bag of fertilizer and we're looking at that NP and K numbers on that bag of fertilizer, that nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, or phosphorus and potassium, they're really in a yard waste fertilizer equivalent to basically 1, 1, 1, sometimes less than 1. So it doesn't have yard waste fertilizers, or compost made from yard waste doesn't have a lot of fertilizer value. The highest fertilizer value you can get out of a compost is that made from poultry manure, and that will get up to between 2 and 3 for all 3 numbers. Still, when you look at a bag of commercial fertilizer, you're looking at much, much, much higher numbers. So the truth is, composts, while they have nutrient content and value to a plant, that nutrient value is really pretty low by comparison to what you might need, for example, for a blooming plant. And you would have to supplement that fertilizer, but that content, but you have to be careful, because you don't have to put quite as much on, because it will bind to the organics in it and be there for much longer than it would if you did not have that organic content. There are also studies that show that compost provides kind of a natural pesticide activity. And basically, really all this is there's good bugs in the compost that outcompete the bad bugs that might be around, the molds and mildews. And so those kinds of things are reduced when you use compost. The other part of using organic matter in soils is that, again, I alluded to that up in the top when I was talking about water holding capacity. The compost breaks up the clay soils, so the roots have more space to grow, and you get more roots as a result of that. And you get more roots also because there's more moisture there, and it makes living conditions better for the root system. And in sandy soil, it retains moisture and helps to grow a stronger root system as well. So in general, you have much healthier plants once you incorporate compost into your soils. And I'm sure that many of you have found that to be true over time. If you're a gardener, and I'm betting that most of you are. One of the things that I did as a quote unquote professional in the field was work with commercial composters. And I get a lot of questions about this, so I thought I'd give a little, why are these two processes different? It's the same composting process, but here are some of the differences. In backyard composting, occasionally I talk to someone who has a really, really big backyard compost pile, which is, by that I mean something over 3 feet by 3 feet. 3 feet by 3 feet is a critical amount, size, in order to keep the compost process, or get the compost process hot. So generally speaking, for those of us like me who never has a pile that big, I have what I call a cold process in my compost bin. It just depends largely on the microorganisms and other critters, worms and millipedes and centipedes and those kinds of things that break down the organic matter. So that is the reason why you are told not to put things like meat, dairy, cheese, pet waste. It's a cold process. And in order to eliminate the risk of salmonella or E. coli, you have to have a hot process, which is down in the commercial section there. And what I mean by a hot process is that you need to have a temperature over 131 degrees for an extended period of time, a minimum of 7 days. Or otherwise you run the risk, although it may not ever happen, but you run the risk of having these salmonella and E. coli risks. So limiting the types of materials is the reason why they tell you to do that. It doesn't kill pathogens, and this gets to the question that I had a little bit earlier about weed seeds. You don't want to put weed seeds in if you don't have a large enough pile to get hot, because you will not sterilize those weed seeds. You have to have a hot process. And this is the reason why in a commercial, if you have curbside collection of yard waste and or food waste, that's being brought to a commercial facility which has a hot process. And by rules of the state of Minnesota, the commercial facilities at a minimum have to have a hot process of 131 degrees at a minimum of 7 days. Depending upon the process you have, it may be 21 days. So it can take quite some significant amount of time to make sure that you've sterilized the weed seeds and killed all the E. coli and bacteria in the compost. This is the reason also why you can put a wider array of materials in that system, is because of that hot process. It kills the weed seeds and the pathogens. So a little bit about backyard and commercial, a little bit more about that. Acceptable materials in the commercial process, you can do meat, dairy, fats, and non-recyclable paper. People will often ask me, can I use paper in my backyard compost bin? And you can, but really, I discourage that, because recycling that paper is a higher and better use, and we should, if at all possible, recycle that paper. And I'll get into how you might be able to recycle the paper and still have enough carbon for your compost facility, your composting. One of the most common questions I get is, do I have to locate my compost bin in the sun? And the truth is, sun or shade makes no difference. You aren't getting the heat for your compost bin from the sun. What you get the heat from, if you have a large enough pile, we're kind of combining chemistry, physics, and biology here in composting, which is kind of one of the things I think that makes it fun. But the heat comes from the breaking of chemical bonds. It releases heat. If you have a large enough pile, you will insulate the process enough so that the heat is held in. So there's the physics of it. It's mass that's important to hold in the heat. And of course, the biology of it is the critters, the live critters, be they bugs, actual bugs, or bacteria that break down the material. So locating it in the sun or shade is not really a big difference for operation of your compost bin. What's really the difference is you really need to have it be close. Nobody wants to troop out to the compost bin that's out in the back 40 when you have 2 or 3 feet of snow that you have to walk through. So having it be located close enough to your house so that you can use it year round is more critical than locating it in the sun or the shade. The other critical piece of locating your bin is having it close to a water source. You do need most years to add some water to the process because it will dry out. In fact, setting it in the sun makes it dry out faster. So having a water source is pretty important. The final thing you really need to do if you are going to be starting to compost is to check your local city ordinances. Many cities have ordinances about the distance from your neighbor's yard, and sometimes they require that it be in a privacy fence area so that people can't see your quote unquote ugly compost bin. I think they're beautiful, but not everybody does. And so you need to check that. Sometimes they regulate what you can put in your compost bin, although most of those regulations really are not really based in science. They're based in what people think you should or shouldn't be doing. So essentially, what I do and the way I think about composting is that you are creating a living environment for these creatures that are going to break down your material. So you want to provide the carbon nitrogen ratio, or the brown and the green ratio of about 70% browns to 30% green material by weight. And then you want to have enough water and air so that these critters can work at their maximum potential. And you don't want it to be over moist because then you can have odor problems. And so one of the ways that you can determine whether you have enough water or not is you can grab some of the yard waste once you've put your browns and greens in, you've mixed them up, you've added a little water, you can squeeze some of the yard waste, and if you get little beads of water forming in between your fingers, that's the proper amount of moisture. If you have water, squeeze it and there's water running out of your hand, then you have too much and you need to add probably a little more browns to absorb some of that moisture. If you don't have either one of those things happening, then it's too dry and you can add a little more water if you want to. One of the things, let me go to the next slide and see what I'm going to talk about. Oh, yeah. Greens. So what are greens? It's basically food waste from your kitchen. And what is that providing to your compost bin? It's providing nitrogen. Food is a high source of nitrogen. So that's your nitrogen source. And there are, vegetable scraps, fruit scraps for the backyard. Some types of paper will be, actually, those are really carbon sources. Green grass clippings are a nitrogen source. If you want to go to the browns, brown grass clippings are a carbon source, as are leaves, straw, paper from coffee filters or tea bags, which don't really amount to much, so you can't really rely on those to provide all of your browns. And small wood waste. I do break up small branches and put them in. They provide a little bit of pore space for the water and the air. And so that's always a nice thing to have. You do actually end up screening those out. My husband was nice enough to make a nice little screen out of a mesh for me, and I screen my compost with that, and it'll screen out these wood chips, but then they go back in and eventually they disappear. So you don't really have to worry too much about that. Again, non-compostable, compostables in backyard composting are dairy, fats, oil, grease, pet waste. Really heavy papers are probably not something you want to put in. Pine needles and black walnut leaves. I get that question a lot. And pine needles are really acidic. And the composting process likes a neutral pH. So you can add pine needles if you wish, but at a very slow rate. And most of the time you have too many to add all at once. If you have a drop site or something where you can take those, if they go into a commercial facility, there's enough of other materials so that they are pretty well diluted and it doesn't impact that process. Black walnut leaves had a lot of tannin, and they don't break down in a cold process. They really need to go to a commercial facility where they have a hot process. The other thing I get a lot of questions on, and I don't have on this slide, is ash, wood ash. Can I put wood ash in my compost bin? And the answer to that question is yes, but you need to be careful with that too, because it's really, really fine. And if you get too much in there, it's going to fill up all the pore space and you won't have any air. So your critters won't live that are breaking down your organic material. And the compost process will essentially stop. So you need to be careful of that, but it adds a lot of nice potassium. And so it's a good thing, but just not in high quantities. Before I go to the common questions, I'm going to kind of go over how I compost, because one of the misconceptions that I had when I started composting in my backyard 20 years ago was that I needed to turn that compost pile right down to the ground every time I went out there. Well, that's just not really true. The compost that's finished actually falls to the bottom. So that's your finished compost. So really, when you're turning your compost bin, if it's not a very big pile, you really only want to turn the top 18 to 20 inches. And so when I go out to my compost bin, I take my garden fork and I fluff up the top 18 or so inches. And then I take my garden fork and I'll put a little hole in my the top of that material, and I'll dump in my food waste from the kitchen. And then I bury it with some leaves so that if there's any odor that I have, because it's sat, for a few days in my kitchen and it has a little bit of an odor, that those leaves that go over the top of that food waste will act as a biofilter and mitigate that odor. So you reduce your risk of odor. And then, I've got this container that I brought out from my kitchen, and it's really kind of nasty. It's got a lot of little juices and maybe a little few things, peels stuck along the side or in the bottom, and that's where the water comes in. I will walk over to my hose, which is about 10, maybe 15 feet away, and I'll fill up my bin, I'll rinse it out and I'll fill it up, and then I'll take that over and I'll put it on my compost in the bin, and I have now fluffed up my compost. I've added my new material. I've protected it against waste of odors, and I've watered it at the same time. So that's something you might want to think about. The other thing is, I said I would talk a little bit about how you can have carbon available to you all summer long, because let's face it, the leaves fall in the fall, and that's not when you're going to necessarily need a lot of them. So in the springtime, when I clean off my gardens, my roses and those things I've covered, I will save 2 to 3 bags of leaves and set it alongside my compost bin, so that in the summer, as we go through the summer and I'm adding my food waste, I have enough leaves to add when I need to. When it looks like everything's really kind of getting to the point of being composted pretty well, I might dump half a bag on there, and then I can continue to put my food waste in and not have any odor issues because I have enough carbon. So that's one way that you can do that. And then you don't need to use, you don't need to buy a hay bale, for example, so that you can put straw in. You don't need to use shredded paper. You've got your leaves sitting right there. So that's something you might want to consider if you haven't really thought about that previously. Um, and common questions, goodness. How long does it take to compost material? Well, it depends upon how diligent you are at managing your bin. If you do like I do, and you kind of mix it once a week, basically that's all I do, and I add new material and I make sure I have enough carbon and I water it once a week, um, I get 5 to 10 gallons of compost in a year. And that would be from the spring to the fall. Um, If you don't do those things, it will still compost. It will just take a lot longer and you'll get a smaller volume. Why isn't it composting? I get this question really a lot. And my first question back is always, well, how much are you watering it? And generally the answer to that is, well, every time it rains or snows, that's when it gets watered. And I think last year was, if I recall right, was a pretty wet year and I didn't have to do a lot of watering. But most years are not that wet, and you do have to water. So if you kind of follow the routine I outlined and water it with a gallon or so of water once a week, you'll do pretty good and it will compost. If you don't, it will look like it's not composting, but it is, but much, much, much more slowly. So water is really a critical um, constituent component of your backyard composting process. I did, and I think I answered this question, how do I know if I have enough? And that's the squeeze test. That's a really common field test at compost facilities. I used to use it all the time when I went out to compost facilities when I was working in the field. Um, why do I have critters in my compost? Well, some critters, of course, you're supposed to have. Others, like bees and ants and mice and snakes and things like that, you really don't want to have in your compost bin. Um, so the major reason why you have those kinds of things in your compost bin is because you haven't watered. You've created this wonderful dry space for these critters to live. It's warm, it's dry, it has food in it. It's just a beautiful place for them. So if you keep your compost bin watered enough, these critters will not like it. It's wet and cold, and they don't want to be there. And you won't have critter problems. But that's generally the reason why people have critter problems is because they don't water and it's a dry, wonderful, warm place. The last question really that I get is, how do you winterize your compost bin? Well, frankly, I don't winterize my compost bin. What I do is I take apart my compost bin and I move it to another spot. My compost bin is in two pieces, so it has 4 clips, 2 on each side, and I can unclip it, pull it apart, and set it right next to the compost that was in there and put it back together. And I will put some leaves on the bottom and I'll turn all the compost, all the undone material that's on the top of that pile that I have sitting there now into the bin, and that's it. I want to have enough space in my compost bin so that when I come out in the wintertime and put my food waste in there, I have enough space for that throughout the wintertime. So in the springtime then, I will go again to usually it's my rose garden because that has the most leaves on it, and I will get a 5 or 6 5 or 6 of the 5-gallon buckets full of leaves and put it in my compost bin and mix it up as I'm doing that so that I get the carbon and the nitrogen, the food waste and the leaves mixed together. And then if it looks a little dry to me, I'll put a little water on it. And that's how I restart my compost bin in the springtime. If you do not have it at for wintertime, you're going to need it more than 3 feet by 3 feet. You're going to want to have it 4 or 5 feet by 4 or 5 feet of footprint to keep that composting and keep that heat in the wintertime. And some of us have that, but most of us do not. So your compost bin really is just going to stop composting until it gets warm again in the spring, and then it will start up again. So I don't worry about winterizing my compost bin because I know that I'm going to be able to start it up again in the springtime just by adding some leaves and maybe a little water in that bin. And the food waste, it freezes, so it destroys the cell structure of the food waste, and it gets pretty liquidy actually in the springtime. And so sometimes you don't have to add too much water, but it makes it a lot easier and to mix the leaves in with, and it decomposes a lot faster too. So you really, that's pretty much what I do to quote unquote winterize my bin. This is my deck. And when I was working, I don't have this problem anymore, of course, but when I was working, I basically had 2 jobs. I had my day job with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and I was on the Plymouth City Council for 18 years. And so I would go to work. I would start working at 5 o'clock in the morning, and I'd be working many, many days until 10 o'clock at night. Well, I decided at one point that, someday we might sell this house and I might move into a townhome, and then I'm gonna, not have my flower gardens and my vegetable garden. And, I really didn't want to give up gardening because I really love to garden. So I thought, well, I'm going to learn how to container garden on my deck, and try to grow some vegetables there and some flowers. Well, the first year that I did this, I just took soil straight from my vegetable garden and put them in my pots. And you can't really tell it from this picture, but in the morning, as soon as I got up, I would water those pots, and I had to drag about 6 to 8 gallons of water a day out to water in the morning. And then I'd go off to work, and I'd come home at 10 o'clock at night, and I'd go outside, and the poor things were so wilted that it was like I thought they were going to die. And so I'm dragging at 10 o'clock at night, I'm dragging another 6 to 8 gallons of water out there to water my plants. And I did this all summer. And I decided at the end of the summer that really, if that's what container gardening was on my deck, it was too much. So the next year, I mixed my compost in with my soil and raised the organic content to between 30 and 50%. And I decreased my watering by 50%. I watered once a day, except on the really hot days, like when it got to 90 or hotter. Then I had to water twice a day. But that goes back to what I talked about earlier in the presentation about the water holding capacity of compost. It is really quite phenomenal, and it can save you a lot of work. It can also contribute to mold and mildew if if you water too much, for example, and you have a high concentration of compost in your flower pots, you can get mildew. And molds, but most of it, I've never really had that problem on the deck simply because it dries out so quickly from the sun. It's a northeast facing, but it gets a lot of direct sunlight during the day. So that's how basically I use my compost. But there are other ways to use your compost. Top dressing around plants outdoors in the springtime or the fall, either way, but springtime was probably the most valuable time to do it. Working that compost into the soil before you plant in your vegetable garden, if you're planting tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, whatever you're planting, green beans, it's all kinds of stuff I plant in my vegetable garden. But one of the ways that I use it the most is in the fall. One of the things I learned when I was working in the composting arena with construction companies is they do a process that they call um, top dressing, dormant seeding, and they will put down grass seed. Most of the time, that's what they're doing, and then mix that with compost and spread it over a wide area. And they do it really super late in the fall, November-ish. I try to wait. Generally speaking, we will get snow by the weekend before Thanksgiving. Sometimes we get it earlier, but it'll melt, and sometimes we get it earlier and it stays. So it's kind of, you've got to watch the weather. But I will throw down grass seed, and then I will throw the compost over that grass seed really late, early to mid-November. And then in the springtime, it's automatically watered when the snow melts. Now, this year it would have been watered many times because the snow is melted and then it's come back and it's melted. And it's really a nice, grass seed grows best in the cool season, which is what we have right now, and it needs a lot of moisture, and that's what we have right now too. And it is an amazing sight to see if you if you have thin areas in your lawn and you use this process, it just fills right in. It's really quite incredible. I've always been amazed that it works so well. But that's another way. So I use it in my flower pots, and I use it to top dress bare spots in my lawn. And I don't really have enough to do the other two types, but you will pick and choose how you use that wonderful product that you created in your backyard compost bin. And I think, yeah, that's it. So I would be very, very happy to answer any questions you might have, assuming I have the answer to that question. Thank you so much for being with us tonight here. Can a compost pile? Yes, it can be in the shade. Absolutely. As I said earlier, the heat, your pile, in order to have the pile be hot, it has to be greater than 3 feet high by 3 feet wide. And if you don't have it that big, at a minimum, that big, all the time, 24/7, not just, when you make it, but all the time, it won't hold the heat in from the breaking of the chemical bonds as the material breaks down, and it will be a cold process. So that's where the heat really comes from. It doesn't come from the sun. People tend to think that the compost process is hot because the sun heats it up, but that's really not why it is. It's from the release of heat in breaking chemical bonds. So what else have we got here? So if cold processes doesn't kill salmonella, do eggshells need to be sterilized? Oh, what a good question. Generally speaking, I put eggshells in my pile, and I don't sterilize them and I don't rinse them. Although you could just rinse out whatever egg is in that. It's such a small amount that it hasn't really posed any risk as far as I can tell to me. I haven't gotten sick from it. So here's the thing about eggshells, though. It's really interesting. I should probably add that to my commonly asked questions. People ask me all the time, can I put eggshells in my compost? And you can. The thing about eggshells is that eggshells are calcium. They aren't really a biodegradable material. Calcium is a rock. And so basically all that happens with eggshells is that they'll break down into little teeny pieces over time. And sometimes they'll take on a brownish color, or sometimes they just stay white. So you have little white flecks in your compost. The geologist in me knows that in the area that we live, we have very high calcium soils. So eggshells just adds a very minuscule amount of calcium to our soils, which is already in the soils and perfectly natural to have. So if you want to be absolutely certain you minimize the risk of salmonella, I would say rinse the shells and then toss them into your compost bucket in the kitchen. But I do not practice that, so it's your choice, composter's choice on that one. Materials to make a compost bin. Oh, can old pallets be used to make a square? Absolutely they can. In fact, other materials that you might use, to be very simple, you can use chicken wire, or hardware cloth. You can get hardware cloth that's about 3 feet high. And one of the things that I use for quote unquote stakes when I use chicken wire or hardware cloth, you have to use wire to hold it together, because the stakes that I use are, if you're familiar with chain link fences, and the ends of the chain link piece are held to the posts by running a flat rod that's about 1/2 inch wide down the chain link, and then you use that to clamp the fence to the fence posts. Well, these rods are about 3.5 feet high, and they poke into the ground very easily. They're not expensive, and you can use them to make your circle with either chicken wire or with the hardware cloth. But if you use hardware cloth, you're going to have to have other wire to wire it to them, because you can't thread the those posts through the hardware cloth. The squares are too small. So I used to have, when I did the state fair, the eco experience building at the state fair, the compost display, I used to have both the pallet type and the hardware cloth displayed at the state fair, and they may or may not have that. I'd have to talk to the gentleman who took my job and puts that together to see if he has it. But I know they do have some of those things still at the state fair, but it's really pretty easy. I believe you can go to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's website, and they have some pictures of some of the different kinds of compost bins that you can make yourself. So there you go. I'll try to get that to Lara, and she can email that out to people. Because I know that they're around somewhere. I just haven't really thought of it for a while, so I have to look for them.
I think the city's selling them too.
Oh, that could be. I have a large compost pile. Would it be best to have several smaller piles going at the same time, or so I can let one cook and let the other one finish? That is frequently what people do. I have just one, but it's because I can take mine apart and move it. And so I can get at my finished compost that way. But oftentimes people, especially when they do pallet bins, they will construct more than one, and and sometimes they use 3 bins. They'll have a place where they keep the leaves that I mentioned that I put in a yard waste bag, a big green yard or leaf bag, lawn and leaf bag, and set it beside my compost bin. Some people will make a little bin just for that. And then they have an active bin where they mix that material with their food waste. And then they have a bin and where they have the finished compost. So a 2 or 3 bin system, it's really, again, the composter's choice. Whatever makes it easier for you is perfectly fine. And I'm pretty sure the information I'll be sending Laura will have those kinds of pictures as well. I'll make sure they do.
Yeah, great.
So let's see. Is the free compost from the county site safe to use, or does it have weeds? Well, that's a really tough question. It depends upon the county. Many of the counties have the material hauled to a commercial compost facility where it's composted, and they have per a contract agreement, they have some of that material brought back for residents to use free of charge. And some of them compost them on site. If they compost it on site, you are more likely to have problem with weed seeds than if it's hauled to a compost facility. Most of the county sites, I'm trying to think because I work with counties still actually a lot through the Minnesota Compost Council, most of them don't really actively manage their compost. And it's probably more the case with city sites if it's just a drop site. And then the city in the springtime will make compost available. They really do not manage those piles. So it's kind of a hit or miss with weed seeds. And so you need to, it's a good question because you need to know that. It's still, good stuff, but you might do a little more weeding than you want to do. So, and I, of course, like to do as little as possible, and don't we all as gardeners? So,
Is it possible to get a copy of this presentation?
yes, it is. I can. In fact, it's on your computer, right? So you have it. You can, you can PDF it.
Selena is asking.
Yeah.
Is it possible?
Yep.
Okay, so
Yep.
Selena, you can get a copy of the presentation. I'll send that
Yeah.
to you.
You can PDF it and send it out to anybody who wants it. It's
idea.
not privileged information.
That's great. Thank you.
So, any other questions we got here?
Peterson.
Suggestions for type of bin. Boy, I just have everybody have, I mean, every time I've ever done this, people have all different kinds of bins. It's really the individual composter's preference. The easiest one is probably pallets because you can get 3 pallets and cup some posts and wire it together and you've got a bin. Some people don't like that. It's kind of unsightly and they want it to look a little prettier. My compost bin I've had so long, the plastic is actually starting to get brittle and I'm kind of thinking about, what am I going to do when I don't have that one anymore because it's crumbled to the ground from being outside for 25 years. But the chicken wire or the hardware cloth ones are just as nice. I would suggest if you're going to use that you maybe leave a 2-foot space or so open so that you can actually get into that bin. Otherwise, you're leaning over the fence trying to turn it and get the finished compost out. And if you leave a little kind of door space, that will allow you access a little bit better to that. Works perfectly good as anything else. So it's kind of your personal preference and how pretty you want it to look.
Marta has a similar question. Do you prefer a wood compost container or plastic?
I don't have any preference.
Yeah. Yeah. They both work.
Yeah, they all work. It's just if you have a preference. Sometimes people don't like to use plastic, and I totally understand that. And like I said, I've had my bin for 20, 25 years, and some of the issues surrounding plastics weren't around then, and it seemed like it was a perfectly safe material. That is being called into question, and so maybe wood is better, but you don't want to use treated wood either. That's another whole nother issue. So if you're going to use wood, ultimately, that will decompose right along with your compost and you'll have to replace that as well. So, it's up to you. I really cannot advise you on that. It's personal preference. Compare this type of composting to the red worm. Oh, well, it's really different. When you're doing the red wiggler composting, which I have done, but now that I'm retired, I'm oftentimes gone for extended periods of time and the poor little worms starve to death. My coworkers used to give me a hard time about being a worm murderer. But worms, the worms ingest the material and they break it down through their biological processes. And really what you get at the end of the worm process is worm poop. And it's very high in water content. And so you'll also get tea from that, which is really good stuff. And I've always, when I was actively worm composting, I would put that in the watering, when I watered those beautiful flowers that you saw on the deck, I'd put it in my watering can and I would use the worm tea for that. But, really it's a whole different set of biology that goes into an outdoor worm or outdoor compost bin as opposed to the worm bin. Worm bins are oftentimes used in townhomes apartments, places where you don't have a lot of space. And that actually is a whole nother presentation because there's a whole different way of managing that. And so I can't, we wouldn't have enough time to do that. I could do that someday, but not today. Do the compost bins that are raised and you can spin seem to work okay? This is a question I get almost every time I do this presentation, and I have had mixed reviews. I've never used one personally, and I've had some women say that they had one, but it was so heavy that they had a hard time turning it. But the guys say, hey, I love this. And that has a lot to do with just our own biology. Women don't have a lot of upper body strength and men have more. So they're able to turn that. The other thing that I hear from people with those drum type compost bins is they dry out really quickly. They're usually smaller, and so water becomes a bigger issue. Watering becomes a bigger issue, and if you add water, of course, it gets heavier. So, I've talked to people who love them, and I've talked to people who don't love them, and largely that's because of the weight of it, and really not anything to do with the compost that comes out of it or anything like that. So again, it's a personal choice kind of thing, but something you might want to consider if you're looking at the drum type for yourself, whether or not that's going to work for you. Can you use grass clippings if fertilizer or weed and feed is used on the grass? Well, yeah, you can. However, this gets back to the hot and cold process. In the hot process, most lawn chemicals, the weed and feeds, are broken down into their chemical constituents, carbon, nitrogen. They don't survive because that process is so hot and for such an extended period of time. On the other hand, if you're in the backyard, it's a cold process most of the time for most of us, and they are not broken down. So you can have residuals carry over, and if you're using it in flowers or something, you might have enough concentration so that it would impede the growth of the flowers or the vegetables. So I wouldn't recommend it if you have a small compost pile in the backyard. You want to stay away from that. Fertilizers are okay. It's the weed and feeds, and if you've got mold or something in your yard and you're using that something to kill that, those are the things that if you use those kinds of chemicals or kill the dandelions or things like that, I would not recommend it for the backyard. I actually wouldn't recommend it at all. But that's again a personal choice. We really don't use that kind of stuff on our lawn. So I never really have to worry about that at all. Here's a question. What does the final product look like? Is it entirely fine like soil, or can there be bigger chunks of yet to decompose materials? It can have the bigger chunks. I tend to screen mine to let's see, it's a 1/2 inch minus size. So, it's not real big chunks, but the really big chunks I toss back into my compost bin. But really, here's the thing, you can even land spread. You don't even have to quote unquote land spread leaf and yard waste. For example, I used to put raw leaves on my vegetable garden in the springtime. The clue here is that that's all carbon. So it's going to take the nitrogen from the soil to break down those leaves. So if you're going to plant in that soon after you've incorporated leaves into the soil, you want to be careful to use a nitrogen fertilizer there so that your plant has enough to grow and there's enough to break down those leaves at the same time. And you can tell if you're having problems, if you've done something like this. You can tell if you're having trouble because the plants will wilt or the leaves will curl or maybe they'll get a little yellow right after you plant them. And so then you need to add a little fertilizer around the base of that plant. And this is germane to the question because if you have big chunks of material still in your compost, that is likely to be a carbon material. And so you're still going to be, they'll be using the nitrogen from the compost and the soils to break down that chunk of, it's probably a piece of wood, most likely. And that really actually shouldn't, because it's a small amount, cause any problems. But again, you might want to watch your plants to see if they're having some issues because it's using up too much of the nitrogen to break down that material.
Cynthia asked that we go back to the first slide.
Oh, okay, sure.
There you go, Cynthia.
What do you got for a question? Is there more to that?
Nope, she just wanted to see the first slide.
Oh, okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Right.
Yeah, that's it's always kind of a fun one to start with because we always talk about, we always say, well, I have really good dirt. Well, you can't have really good dirt because that's kind of a nuisance. What you have is a really good soil. Right. Oh, it's all in how you say it.
Rob is asking if there are any types of bins to avoid. Have you covered that already?
No, I haven't. And I have not ever had anybody say I use this bin and it was just horrible. Don't ever recommend it. The kinds of bins that we've been talking about are pretty much the most common, and they're all good. It's just what you want to do yourself personally.
Okay, great. I don't know if they can hear me if I ask the question.
Not a composting question per se, but if I go through a number of pots and take half the soil out and mix the compost with the remainder, what do I do with the old soil? Oh, well, I would just break it up enough so that I would just sprinkle it out over my lawn, if you have a lawn. And it, you can dispose, quote unquote, dispose of it that way, or use it, really is better way to say it. You can use that excess dirt that way and it will be just fine. I bake my eggshells at 350 degrees for 10 minutes. It seems to make them more brittle and they break down into tiny pieces. Great tip. That's wonderful. No one has ever told me that. That's wonderful. Thank you. Hopefully that helps folks.
Yeah.
All winter I've been putting kitchen veggies, fruit scraps, eggshells, and coffee grounds in a compost tumbler outside my garage door. When spring comes, should I add grass and leaves? Well, green grass is a nitrogen source, which is the food waste you have in there. So if you've got some leaves someplace and covering some plants, yeah, you might want to mix some carbon in with all that nitrogen that you've been storing up all winter, and it should start the compost process. What type of thermometer would you use? I haven't really looked at this. I did one summer because I was kind of curious to know. I have a cold process, but I wondered, what does that mean? What kinds of temperatures am I getting? And so I borrowed a professional thermometer from a composter and used theirs. They had an extra one and used that. And that was who was that? They're pretty expensive. There are some less expensive ones at the garden stores, and I have one, but I've never used it, so I really can't make any recommendation here. What I can tell you is that when I was monitoring the temperature of my compost bin over the summer, I would go out every morning about 7 o'clock in the morning, and I would take the air temperature with a thermometer, and then I'd stick it in my compost bin, and pretty generally, the compost, whatever the air temperature was, the temperature in the center of my compost pile was 18 to 20 degrees higher than the air temp. So that means, if it's 60 degrees, it's only going to be about mid 70s, maybe it'll hit 80. If the day before was 90, well, you might get up into the hundreds then in the next morning. But that's about it. And so that's why when I say it's a cold process, that's really what I mean. You don't ever reach that 131 degrees that you need to kill the salmonella and E. coli.
Would there be any reason to leave things like candy or other kinds of junk food out of the material I add to my compost? Can you add candy?
It's sugar. The bugs would probably love it.
Yeah.
I've never have done it, mostly because I don't eat that much candy. I wouldn't recommend it in high quantities, but if you have an occasional piece of hard candy or something,
or
you
some
can.
Doritos.
Doritos.
Is there any reason why you would keep them out?
No, I think you could do that. It's cooked. It shouldn't be a problem. You should be able to do that. Yep, it does.
Okay, so we have another, let's see, compost.
You might have some spicy compost, though. It depends upon your Dorito chips.
Nice. Best type of composter, barrel type you turn or open top?
Again, it's personal preference. Mine is an open top. I don't ever put the lid on. I have a lid. I've never put it on because then when it does rain, I get the benefit of that moisture. But it really, if you have a lid on, you're going to have to water it more. So if you have a barrel type and it's enclosed, you're going to have to water it more. But again, some people like that. It encloses the material and they feel better about that. South Dakota State University 40 years ago started the first class saying that dirt is what you get under your fingernails. Yes, and soil is what we will study. Absolutely. Thank you. Absolutely, I agree.
Do you know where Minneapolis does their hot composting?
Oh yeah, I do. They're on the Minnesota. One of the board of directors is from that company. It's SET. The compost site is out in Dakota County, southern Dakota County, and they are one of the most reputable composters in the state. They've been around a really long time. They do a really great job. They have good markets for their finished material. When I go get compost, if I need compost, because generally speaking, I do oftentimes need compost, especially when I'm doing the dormant seeding in the fall, I will go to their site. And they have a site out in Minnetrista that has a lot of nice yard waste compost. And then they have that site down in Dakota County. And they have them all over. They are, their website, they sell their material under the name The Mulch Store, not.
Oh, I've used the Mulch Store.
Yeah, yeah, and that's they're excellent. I couldn't give you a better recommendation for buying. If you're going to buy compost, go to the Mulch Store. Is it okay to just pile my materials? Yes, it is. Or must I construct a bin? You do not have to do that. I'll tell you what, here's the story behind my bin. I started with just a pile, but we had a dog and he liked the vegetable scraps and he would go out and snack in the backyard. So I decided that really wasn't what I wanted him to do. So I had to get a compost bin. But otherwise, I may never have had a compost bin except for that. Horse manure for composting. Again, this is a material that can carry some salmonella or E. coli, mostly E. coli. And so you have to be sure that it gets hot for an extended period of time so that you reduce that risk. But if someone else is composting it, you want to ask them, how do they monitor it to make sure that they are composting it and it's getting hot and killing that. Otherwise, even getting it from someone who's composting that material could be a problem for you as well. But manures of any kind have that risk and you need to be careful.
So Sue is asking if there should be elevation.
So the compost is easier to get to.
Does it fall down? Does it matter? Does it dry out too fast or anything like that?
No, not really. elevating it isn't gonna make a lot of difference. The compost just naturally, it's heavier than the material that you're putting in, than the food waste or the leaves. And so it just naturally migrates to the bottom as it finishes. The probably the bigger issue is accessing it, because I don't know, can you find my bin that's in the presentation? Um, a lot of these, you can see in this one, it has a little door at the bottom of it. And I'll tell you what, it's harder than heck, one, to get that door up high enough so that you can then get in and get the material that's at the bottom of the bin. You'll notice on this bin, which is what I do with this bin, is there's little clips on the side. There's two on either side, and they slide up and down and they come off. And I can actually pull it apart once I get those clips off, and I can set it right beside. So, and then I reassemble it. It's really easy to put back together. I've never used the doors. And then I'll put a little bit of fresh leaves on the bottom of my bin. And then about halfway down, this material isn't composted, and so I'll just turn it into the new space and then to the new bin. And so I have a 2-bin system with 1 bin. Basically is what it amounts to. These unfortunately are not for sale anymore. And I've looked and looked and looked, because I think I would replace this bin with a new one if I could find one, but they don't make them anymore, unfortunately. But that's why, and all the questions regarding, access to a compost bin, you need to have a way to get at that stuff, that's the good stuff that's on the bottom. And you need some kind of a space that allows you into that bin. And pallets do that very nicely. And chicken wire and hardware cloth can, so long as you leave a little open space that allows you to get in and get that good stuff.
So do you think the mulch store for good commercial compost near Plymouth?
That mulch store is in Minnetrista, and it's near Plymouth. It's probably, let's see, what do I have to, about 30 miles maybe away. It's not real close, but it's not that far either, and it's wonderful stuff. Absolutely
deliver.
Wonderful. They do deliver, yes, they do. If you need enough, I generally don't ever need enough to have it delivered. I go get it. The slides as well.
Oops. Oh no.
Oh,
Sorry.
Did someone ask, should I fertilize my compost bin?
You put fertilizer, organic?
Yes, you can. Generally, you don't need to, unless if you have just leaves and you need some nitrogen, that would be certainly one way to get some nitrogen into it. If you don't have food waste or don't want to put food waste in your bin, you could do that. Some people will even put commercial fertilizer. The one thing you want to be careful about, any kind of fertilizer, organic fertilizer wouldn't have it, but the commercial fertilizers that are not organic may have, weed killers and things like that, and you don't want that. You want to stay away from that. Just a straight up nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus fertilizer is what you want to go with. And no organic fertilizer, of course, will ever have any of those kinds of chemicals in it. So they'd be perfectly safe.
So I put the wrong page up for Cindy. She wanted this page.
Oh, okay.
Name.
Yeah.
There you go.
There you go. That's who I am. You can Google me on the internet and I'll pop up all over the place. It's crazy. It's crazy what that internet knows about you. as we are hearing. So I live on a lake. What would weeds out of the, oh, they'd be fine. That does happen often, actually. I have a very large compost pile. Yeah, I'm sure you do if you're putting your weeds from the lake in there, or it sounds like maybe you aren't. You must have maybe a pretty large yard. But yeah, those coming out of the lake would have water, and they're green. They'd be a nitrogen source. So yeah, you definitely can do that. Mm-hmm. Yep.
So she's saying thank you.
Oh, you are so welcome. I am so happy that I was able to impart something to a person who's been composting for years. That's wonderful.
That's very cool. Sue wants to know how to get to the stuff on the bottom.
Yeah, that is all about having one part of the bin open so that you can stick a shovel on the very bottom and you pull it out like that. And it's kind of a lot of work. And that's why people will go to a two-bin system where they can actually turn the undone stuff into that second bin, and then automatically the material that's done is compost will be available to you. And it's a little bit easier. So, and like I said, I essentially have a two-bin system, even though I only have one bin, because I can take mine apart and move it. And that's how I do it, actually. So
it's really smart. So Sue is also wondering how often
I harvest.
Can you harvest?
Well, I usually harvest twice a year, once in the spring and once in the fall. And that's when I generally tend to use it. The rest of the remainder of the year, I don't really need it. Because I've got growing plants and they're growing in my compost that I harvested in the spring, or I'm seeding some spot in my yard and I want to cover up the seed a little bit so that it'll grow real nice in the spring. And that's really kind of all I do. And in the springtime, like I said, I'll get about a 5-gallon bucket and maybe another 1.5 of those. And in the fall, I get less because it's been a little less time. So that's all I get.
Terrific.
Yeah, well, it's kind of late. It's 8:12. You guys have really hung in there with us. And, you know, you can find me and get a hold of me if you have questions by going to the Minnesota Compost Council's website. We've got a Gmail account, and I get that, or at least I will be. One of my board members changed the password. I haven't been able to get on it for a couple days, but I have the password now and I will be on it. Sure. So thank you all so very much. And it was just a lot of fun to give this.
Thank you so much, Jenny. That was so wonderful. Thanks everybody for joining us. We all spaces. So thanks again. Thanks for all the great questions. And thank you so much, Jenny. My pleasure. Have a great night.